Welcome to the Caizin Commune Podcast, Who Has a Clue, where we talk to people who indeed do have a clue, such as yourself. And before we start picking up on topic, Nisha, could you mind give a brief introduction of yourself, what you do and what do you offer?
Sure. So, Ameya, I currently am a psychotherapist, practicing psychotherapist. I'm also a trainer and consultant when it comes to the corporate space. And my main advocacy and focus is preventive mental health solutions and strategies. So, what I'm looking to do is take some of the resources mental health wise in terms of, whether it's programs, whether it's reading material, whether it's even dialogue and conversations, and bringing it to different spaces. So whether it's in the community, whether it's in workplaces. And yes, another project that I'm also part of right now, which I would like to spotlight, is my company, Mind Wellness Singapore, is also working with the local government to create upstream mental health support in our communities. So this is a little bit about what I have going on right now. And yeah, I look forward to our conversation today because what we're going to be talking about in terms of work from home has been a very, very big conversation that I have with clients, with,
Yes.
even colleagues and friends. So let's get into it.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time and joining us. The reason I wanted to talk to you and bring upon you as the first speaker for this podcast is because you have stepped inside offices, stepped inside organizations to see what has worked and what hasn't, and in fact, even advised and rectified them to go and align themselves to know what is right for them. Right. You have actually counseled teams and employees as well to effectively work remotely and also identify what may not be working or maybe a long lasting damage or benefit of that sort. So, yeah, we can jump right into it.
Sure. So I think let's start from the starting, right? So where did it all begin? I think let's talk about the pandemic being the being the starting place of this. I'm going to actually reflect back to your phrase that you said is the necessity is the mother of all invention. And I think this is what expedited the pandemic, definitely expedited us moving into this sort of working style where we didn't have choices. We had to be at home and learn very quickly to adapt to working remotely. And I know depending on the industry people were in, there were some serious challenges. So, there are a lot of organizations and companies who already had the infrastructure in place,
Right.
who were in that space with some format of remote or hybrid working already being part of the norm. And so I think those are the organizations that adjusted really well and quite rapidly, might add. But for roles and for organizations where physical working was a key part of the day to day, I think that's where the struggles were most evident.
Right.
I'm going to give an example, which is not a very conventional example when we first think about it, but I'll tell you the group here actually that got thrown pretty much into the deep end very quickly with very low turnaround and response time is our educators, our teachers, because this is not something in that environment that was even thought of as a plan. Because there is we use a lot of digital media in teaching in schools, yes, agreed. But when you think about flow, when you think about structure, when you think about the way lessons are conducted, you're, as a teacher, not factoring this idea even remotely that everything suddenly you're going to have to do, whether it's lesson planning, whether it's marking, whether it is lesson delivery styles, etc., everything is going to have to be remote.
So this changed work environment where probably you're trying very hard to gain your focus and manage your distractions and also temptations. I mean, of course, you're absolutely tempted to play with your child or just put on the TV and just start watching something because something is airing, while you actually have to put in about 7 to 8 productive hours in a day. What do you think? How does that affect in general the whole work day?
How I'll come about this is, I think, the idea of this adjustment curve. So what you just described is probably the initial phases when you're getting used to it. It's a new thing and you have all of, these distractions around it. Because when you talk about the category of parents, I totally understand this, because especially parents who have younger ones now, I know this wasn't easy. And especially if both partners are working, this was a bit of a challenge, because then if you have kids in the house, then it's about tag teaming and taking care of them. But the good part is, I think this brought out a lot of compassion. So even when I was sitting in business meetings, there were kids, there were cats, there were animals, there were a whole host of things that were happening. For the first time ever, it was a global normal. Everybody was going through this together. So there was compassion for it. But let's now fast forward the conversation to today. Tell me, I'd be very curious about India, where I am in Singapore right now. Things have very much opened up, and I think it's good all around because people are coming back into the workplaces. But this is where I think we go into the next conversations of the working styles of today and how much we've inherited from the pandemic. But what I would want to actually pick your brains on, Ameya, is talk to me from your end, talking about the tech industry specifically. My assumption, if I'm from the outside, was that, I would imagine tech, or at least certain facets of tech, and translating to digital would have been fairly easy. So I'm going to pass it to you to share more.
Thank you for that one. Okay, this is going to ruffle a few feathers and I'm going to take it up for it. Okay, so please bear with me on that. For the tech industry, for the large part of it, our infrastructure is quite flexible because because SaaS is there and now we have cloud infrastructure, etc. Connecting to your workplace is not really a struggle, but it was also about keeping those servers up, keeping the internet up, keeping your VPN up so that people can connect to your network remotely as well. So that did happen, right? The reason why I keep on picking up on this particular topic is because I don't think we have still found our equilibrium. So things are still reorganizing ourselves. And I do believe that the pandemic has been the key point in making our decisions around this. What has happened is that people have gone into some kind of a zone where they did not know how to cope with this thing, to now they feel that this is the way I can work forward and probably there is no other way I can do better. That is the reason why I see a very divided approach, right? Just a few weeks ago, people were saying that this is in for the long haul. The government itself, they kind of made it okay for SEZs to have 50% attendance without having to submit their attendance record to the SEZ Development Commissioner. And now, just today morning news is that it's possible that they would consider 100% work from home because the service exports from India don't really add up. So if they are actually profit making or if they are contributing to the country's GDP very well, things may be working, or that's the aspect of it. In the same breath, there are companies who have actually given a date saying after this date, please come back, please report back to work. So I'm pretty sure there are two sides of the stories, and I will go back to you. The industry specificity for work from home is extremely important.
So no, it's good that you mentioned it because in Singapore, actually, we saw something similar too. However, we're small physically. So as a result of this, just in terms of infrastructure, medical infrastructure as well, what we experienced was a very calibrated opening, reopening phases. We do have limited infrastructure. So I think the measures here needed to be reflective of that. And so what we did see was phases of opening and very, very quick retractions or reversals into shutting down into what we called circuit breakers. So it was calibrated. So I think what was essential and maybe why we got so used to it here is because we needed to be ready for both. And this is what I call locus, the idea of your locus of control, right? So what's happening externally, you can't really control that is coming your way, but how you adapt is very important. So I think because of this, organizations realize that, hey, whatever we're doing, we need to be ready for this. We need to be ready for this resilience in being able to move in and out of the systems. And then it got comfortable for people. So we are creatures of comfort and habit. And so let me tell you, share some interesting findings, at least in Singapore. There was a survey. So this came out in one of our local media's studies where I think the Institute of Policy Studies did quite an extensive survey about work from home. So among respondents who were currently working from home, and and felt that working from home on most days or flexible working arrangements should be the new norm for workplaces. Around 42% of the respondents indicated that they would consider looking for another job if their employer required them to return to the office on most days. So this is the hot button topic right now. We saw this phenomenon of the Great Resignation, and this has been an interesting thing that we're seeing. So I know earlier this year we had some examples like Tesla making some headlines in terms of, come back to the workplace. So this has been controversial, companies taking some decisions. So because I think in their case, we need to start zooming in as well from industry specificity to even within organizations. Now, obviously, in terms of manufacturing, so, when we're looking at, for example, Tesla cars, that decision where you do need a lot of supervision and physical oversight, there is some degree of understanding at least where that decision is coming from. Yeah. However, the more common real on the ground reality that we're observing is that organizations are actually adopting a flexible approach, because even in manufacturing or sometimes finance and the tech side, you are seeing groups where their physical presence is non-negotiable. And bless them, but even with them, there is this awareness, okay, how can we be accommodating? How can we be flexible? Maybe not in terms of them being there, but how can we support our employees? So I like that COVID has lent this new sense of awareness to leadership, management, and teams to think about it this way. And I think that's so important. That's a gift I would say we got out of COVID. And I will also add to this that companies that have successfully done this, that have taken the temperature on the ground, that have listened, that have an effective communication gateway with their employees and really checking in with their teams and understanding what they need and have calibrated to it, are the ones that have succeeded. So of that same study, what they also did find is that the mental health and well-being of employees was significantly greater if their current working style matched their personal preference of working. And I think that's so powerful, right? That tells you that this is something where the decision being driven has to be just as much top down as it is bottom up. And I think that's where the success point will lie. So this is my perspective, or basically what I've observed as trends as well, because the consequence of not doing that was what we saw actually through the Great Resignation. And I think it definitely was a wake-up call for companies. Yeah. How about you in India? What did you notice?
So I will still speak for the tech, even if it is in India, right? Yeah. So at least in my part of the world, thinking is everything. I mean, our work is actually thought-provoked. And that's how we actually deliver. And we have to work in teams to do bigger and better things. That's the fact of the matter, really. And what happened was, because now we were pretty much virtual with everyone, I personally realized that everybody is different. The way they work is different. Maybe even if we look only at the outcomes, whether that outcome was achieved or not, if we start measuring from that angle, we would probably empathize better that if this person would encourage shorter conversations over one long meeting, so be it. And then you have to accommodate around it. But that's where the practices came back by the principle, by the book, right? So when we say that these are team agreements and this is how we live by, this is how we become effective, using the right tools to kind of make everything effective and just kind of giving the right tools in the hands of the people so that they can deliver was all about it. So it actually started with like a right table, right chair, good enough internet access with backup, because electricity and internet backup is crucial. And so at the end of the day, how you want to operate your business, because I want to see this on from both the sides, right? As an employer and as an employee, both the perspectives have to kind of align themselves. As an employer, you need to be ready for a particular way of working, and you need to probably say that out loud more. You need to have more conversations with your people to tell them that this is what we are going to do, this is how we are going to go ahead. And then the employee says, okay, this is what works the best for me. And it's a conscious conversation to be had. So I'm seeing a rise in people functions in most companies out here, wherein be it doing frequent checkpoints with your employees. And that requires skill, by the way. It's not as simple as it looks. So you definitely need skilled people. You need people who are advisories, who have been there, done that. Again, like yourself. That is also the reason why I wanted to talk to you. Did you encounter any situations where people were not really comfortable? Because when I talk about the blind side, right, you said we are, I mean, slave to the habit. It takes some time before we realize whether the habit is good or not, whether it is detrimental to our well-being or not. And how do we recognize that? Do you have any tips for probably people to know whether the comfort zone where you have landed into, is that comfort zone really comfortable and going to reward you, or probably going to give you more pain in the long run? What are the early signs? What do you think they are?
That's a very interesting question. Okay, so I'll come at it like this. I'm so glad you touched on it, by the way. There's a nuanced point before I get to this answer that I want to address, where you spoke about the decision being employer-employee driven and not in terms of what the traditional norms were. It's so important to have the communication loop open. If a team says that, no, our function, even it may not be, for example, as clear cut as, okay, the physical requirements for space, safety, security need you to be there. It may be just that this particular team is not doing as well in a remote working setting, and maybe they should be coming back into the workplace. The ability to have that conversation is so important. And so this extends back to a point around organizational culture that I do want to address before we come into individual habits and working styles, where in South Asian culture, our culture and our language and some of our systems, more traditional systems, and I'm mindful that I'm making a generalization because there are always exceptions to the rule. But it is this, that we don't usually, even in our own interpersonal spaces or in the workplaces, very used to having open conversations about pain points, needs, and expectations. When there is distress within the organization, or when there is something that needs to be highlighted, what is the recourse available for employees to voice this? So in the middle of the pandemic, an interesting phenomenon was Clubhouse chat rooms became the venting ground. People were like, oh, I'm not liking this. This is, my employers are being too strict about A, B, C, or D. This was very common. Like, I was hearing this on the ground. In fact, that's why I really became passionate, because I realized a lot of mental health issues were also cropping up around this, because in certain ways there was a lack of flexibility, or at least it took a while, because very early on in the pandemic, we were not a culture that was very necessarily used to this, where employers felt uncomfortable. And so I'm giving grace to both sides, employers and employees. So this may have been slightly, employees had their own struggle with work from home, but for younger parents with kids, this was actually a bit of a boon. But for employers as well, the struggle is they have immersed themselves into a certain mindset and a way of working, and suddenly they did have to snap out of it. And it's not easy. So when I talk about habit, you see, that's the other thing. I think it was a wake-up call for them, because a lot of them towards the tail end of it with the Great Resignation eventually did get the memo that, hey, my habit, maybe my earlier habit of the way I was doing things, that no, it's my way or the highway, that format of culture or top-down approach, employees in a way then, vote with their feet. So they walked. As I think a Mercer study as well, which did note that pay, perks, and a lot of the traditional incentives companies were giving to keep employees were not working. So I'm going to come back to then answering the question about habits and how we landed. I think COVID did something very interesting. It shone a very bright spotlight. And as a result of that, what was working became very obvious, but what was also not working became very obvious. It's this idea when you face your mortality in a way, it will do that too. It's an unconscious phenomenon that will happen. It makes you reevaluate your priorities. And for some people, that's why that statistic that I mentioned, 42% of people, they really are willing to walk, and they will. What happens next is the question, because we need to have this longer term sustainability projection. Absolutely. So how long is this format of working sustainable? And this will go back to, again, industry and organization specificity. Because
True.
if you have already calibrated, tested in this window, and you know what's working for you, fantastic. But if you haven't, then my message out there is a very worthwhile exercise in having complicated conversations.
So let me give you a little bit of a peek inside the way we function at Caizin, right?
Sure.
So Caizin was actually a pandemic formed company. We created the company, we formed it in last 2 years. It's a young company,
right,
but full of experienced people. So collective experience and within the leading team is almost about plus 100 man years plus, right? So now having said that, having been there, done that kind of a deal, we truly believe in the whole flat hierarchy thing. So actually giving responsibility and accountability to people, so practicing this more and more often kind of builds the culture for us, right? And that has kind of worked for us for the large part of it. So of course there will be exceptions to this particular rule, wherein people will probably want to be led versus they want to follow. For the most part of it, our recurring meetings are set up only one day apart, and which is great because that kind of helps everybody get enough time for themselves to organize themselves, organize their work, look at what they have to deliver, come back to the team and say, okay, this has been done, so on and so forth. Another team who likes to be more collaborative, we actually sync up twice a day and do more shorter runs of what we have to do in the day, which is good. I mean, if that is what works for the team, so be it. So the reason why I go back to well-being and stuff like that, not just conversations with people around you, with be it your family or your boss, your immediate boss, or even your peers, I think it's easier to rant and crib than to actually listen and work upon it, right? So people do get judgmental very quickly. People get personal with it. Like I said, right, these are special skills which did not need a lot of attention in the past, but now they are surfacing a lot more. So I think everybody needs to kind of devote certain amount of their time to just hone these skills and come around it, because that is where this is how we will excel. And if we want to make this sustainable, like you said, there are certain amount of skills and tools which will help us reach there.
So there are two things I think I do want to just, maybe we can sort of bring this conversation to a close on. Recently you had the New York Times and employees, about 1,300 employees who are still there in the midst of negotiations about fully coming back into the workplace. Now, the interesting reasoning there is actually around costs in a Southeast Asian city where transportation costs became a big issue. And not just the cost, but that if you're driving, it's the petrol, but otherwise it's even the traffic. And this is common in a lot of South Asian cities where these features matter. I know it's interesting to think about other factors as well that drive the decision. Another feature and phenomenon that's growing is digital nomading. So this is for the other end of the spectrum where people are realizing that they want to travel, and in their role and function, remote working is actually very powerful for them. So in the creative professions, this has been a new uptick, and even you see governments and raising policies where this digital nomad visas are starting to roll out, at least in Southeast Asian countries. I'm seeing that happening in sequence. And, I wanted to throw that back to you. Is there some other considerations as well that have come across your desk that influence this working styles?
So in the city, the houses are costlier, right? Now, when you don't have to go to your office every day, you can actually very well spend the same amount of money on your dream house, which is probably in the outskirts of the city, because now you don't have to travel to work. There is the other part of it also. There are so many companies out there which are calling people back to office. It may not be an organization-wide strategy, right? I mean, not a policy decision to come back to office or work from home. But I believe to run probably a larger organization, which has 10,000 plus employees, etc., probably for them to manage, it would become a more management overhead than a benefit. So for them, I can probably still understand why they may be going through that particular move. However, if they were inclusive in this decision making, it would have helped. Then that decision would also have been more welcome, and people have probably accepted it more wholeheartedly. Okay, I may sound really overly optimistic, but it could have been possible to kind of at least reduce the impact of the great resignation or quiet quitting or whatever it may be. Now the moonlighting is...
Moonlighting. being able to, yes, like you're saying, the impact of great resignation, this was in companies where the communication of decision making or the structure is where the employees did not have flexibility of say. That's why I said, if you can't vote with anything else, you vote with your feet. So now that we have looked at all of these different considerations, let's bring it back to the you and me. So say, for example, the everyday employer who's going through this, because every person who's now showing up at the workplace says, oh, I may not have decision-making powers, or this, how can this conversation apply to me? I think maybe more specifically, I'd like to ask you, Ameya, is in your organization, when you're yourself distressed, when your employees are distressed, how is that managed? What is the process?
The process is as human as it can be, to be very honest with you. Okay. So the first and the foremost, there is an equal bond as I would have with any friend, with all of my colleagues. Okay. So because we are a smaller setup, it's much easier to do that. And that is actually kind of handled within the onboarding exercise itself. So when we bring upon employees into our teams, and we are hiring for who they are more than anything else, and absolutely conscious of the fact that we have to work with them either in the office or remotely, or so that metric has to be gauged, whether he will be a part of our culture, or how would we have to change if we have to leverage his expertise onto our team. We really want him, but probably there are some adjustments which we will have to do in order to work with him. We will walk that extra mile, right? So, and we have been doing that for a long amount of time. So when it comes to, let's say specifically about stress or something, he would get some extra TLC from our side. It's possible that we send him on a paid vacation of sorts. If they're remote, we just fly them down into the city, make him work from the office. Just the whole social environment kind of changes the vibe a little bit. I, as a person, I'm extremely watchful. So I'm extremely cautious about burning people out, because there are people who probably may not have the ability to deny or to say no. So we keep throwing work at them, or it's possible that work flows in through different channels, right? So we have to be absolutely mindful of the fact, saying, please deny when a request comes your way, and we would absolutely understand, and there is no judging about it, right? Because like I said, so ultimately the outcome matters. Whether you're doing it by working early in the morning, or you're a night owl, does not really matter. So I know cases where people had put bots onto people's machines so that they know that they're still active. So all those things is not something
we saw that here too. And I think from a mental health angle, I have to say this, that's a very good way to ensure low output and productivity, because you're literally putting people into their fight responses and into a fear zone. So good luck trying getting productivity out of them, because when you are in that, fight or flight state, or you're really stressed that, oh my God, my employer is watching, your thinking brain, your capacity to operate and function is significantly reduced, and you can't even fight the biology on this. So what you brought out was very powerful, because social interactions and engagement is a very important component of us being able to regulate ourselves. And I think this is my core focus, and I think message going forward as well when we talk about mental health in workplaces, is we need to look at self-regulation and co-regulation. So now our ability to soothe and regulate ourselves in environments of stress. So pre-pandemic, we used to have an equal balance of a lot of social interactions. You would have, in fact, you would see colleagues Fridays, drink Fridays out, etc. And that social component is also very helpful in being able to create that balance in our bodies and our nervous systems to counteract the chronic stress, or I would call it, in this space of 2 years, what it's done is it's completely thrown off our ability to regulate. Doing that even virtually, it is possible, but you have to be very intentional about doing it. So even like, say, for example, you're in the workplace, your team might be remote, but what you've just described is very intentional measures of check-ins, support, cushioning, a good, healthy conversation that can help employees. These are the things that are going to support our, in a way, I am going to call it recovery from this state of, heightened stress. We're still, trust me, our bodies, everybody says the next pandemic is the mental health pandemic. Yeah. And our mental health is not exclusive to our minds. It's connected to our bodies. So I think we do have to be mindful about this, be observant about it as individuals. And as companies, companies and organizations, to anyone listening out there, what you can do is note that this is, if you do want to increase productivity, the supporting of your employees, having that space where you are creating safety, you're creating a zone where employees can come and they can regulate with you, is the fastest way you're actually going to achieve productivity increase. This is how you build that lasting connection and bond with your employees and retain loyalty. The moment you have awareness is a good starting point. So these are some things to maybe think about and take away. I think let's just go over it as a recap. So I'm going to pass this to you, Ameya, and maybe you can share some takeaways.
So yeah, this whole journey of which goes from unconscious adapting to consciously embracing this new change is extremely crucial. So as a part of this particular point, I definitely want to tell everyone out there, do what works the best for you. In fact, knowing what is best for you also will take certain amount of work. So spend some time there to know whether you're in the right place, doing the right kind of stuff, working the right way, so that you do not burn yourself out in the long run. When it comes to assessing the long-term viability, I just want cognizance to come in on a very high scale, be it with an employer or a company, on how they want to work with their people, or whether it comes from the people themselves saying, this is how we work, and what is it? Can we shake hands somewhere, or is there some kind of a middle ground? Yeah.
And I'll go for it for the last 2 points. Then I think then an extension of that is organization culture. And I think I've stressed this a lot in our conversation, is effective communication is key. In terms of the whole working styles approach, looking at it where, depending on the size and scale of your organization, being very intentional in this decision if you're going to take an organization-wide strategy or a team-centric strategy. And I think the last point is work-life boundaries. So being mindful as organization that you have to respect your employees, and this idea of boundary setting has become quite clear. Here locally, there's a big push for companies to be aware of, post office hour communications, expectations being laid out with employees. I think things like this is important to be mindful of, especially if you're in leadership and managerial roles.
No, that was a fantastic summary. I think this helps, Nisha. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ameya. Have a wonderful day.
Take care.
Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.